On May 5, 2026, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth stepped up to a Pentagon podium flanked by General Dan Caine, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The cameras rolled, the reporters leaned in, and for roughly 40 minutes, the American public was given a carefully curated picture of a war now 67 days old. They called it a ceasefire. They called it Project Freedom. They said Iran did not control the Strait of Hormuz. But what did they not say? That's what we're here to find out. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on the most consequential military standoff the United States has entered since Iraq, a conflict that has already cost tens of billions of dollars, rattled global energy markets, and left over 22,000 sailors stranded at sea. This is the full story, the official narrative, the gaps in it, and the hard truths hidden between the lines of every Pentagon press release. To understand what the Pentagon is not telling you today, you first need to understand how the United States ended up at war with Iran in the first place. It didn't begin on February 28, 2026, the day the bombs fell. It began in the corridors of the White House weeks earlier, when Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu flew to Washington and made a personal appeal to President Donald Trump: strike Iran now or lose the opportunity forever. According to multiple reports, it was Israeli intelligence, provided directly by Netanyahu, that became the decisive factor in Trump's authorization of what the Pentagon codenamed Operation Epic Fury. The official justification? The Trump administration announced that Iran had restarted its nuclear program and was developing ballistic missiles with the range to strike the continental United States. They also pointed to the 2025-2026 Iranian protests, a crackdown that killed thousands of civilians, as evidence that the regime had become dangerously destabilized and unpredictable. But here's the first thing the Pentagon didn't tell you clearly enough. According to an unspecified Pentagon source who spoke to Congress in closed-door briefings, there was no intelligence confirming that Iran was planning an imminent preemptive strike on American assets. The administration did not provide any evidence to the public that such a threat was credible and immediate. In other words, the casus belli, the legal and moral justification for launching a war, was murky from day one. On February 13th, the USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group was reported en route to the Middle East, creating an unusual two-carrier concentration in the theater. By late January, the U.S. had already assembled one of the largest military buildups in the region since the 2003 invasion of Iraq: carrier battle groups, long-range bombers, missile defense batteries, and forward-deployed ground forces. The trap was set. The only question was when the trigger would be pulled. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched joint airstrikes on Iranian missile infrastructure, leadership nodes, and nuclear-related facilities. The 2026 Iran war had begun. Now let's talk about what the Pentagon did tell you, and why even those disclosures deserve scrutiny. At the peak of combat operations, the U.S. military assembled what analysts called the most significant force concentration in the Middle East in decades. Let me walk you through the scale of it. At sea, a 3-carrier configuration anchoring the operation. The USS Abraham Lincoln had been operating in the Arabian Sea since late January, positioned roughly 700 kilometers from Iranian shores. The USS Gerald R. Ford arrived in mid-February, and on March 31st, Carrier Strike Group 10 departed Naval Station Norfolk, arriving in CENTCOM's area of responsibility by April 23rd. For the first time in decades, 3 aircraft carriers were simultaneously operating in the Middle East. Each carrier strike group includes destroyers, cruisers, submarines, supply ships, and dozens of combat aircraft. The combined firepower of these 3 groups is staggering, enough to sustain weeks of intensive air operations across an entire country. In the air, 12 F-22 Raptor stealth fighters were deployed to Avda Air Base in southern Israel as early as February 24th, marking the first time the U.S. had deployed offensive weaponry on Israeli soil. Long-range bombers provided strategic depth. NATO AWACS surveillance aircraft were reportedly monitoring Iran from Turkey, though Ankara later denied providing assistance. On the ground, thousands of soldiers and Marines began arriving in the region in late March, as the Pentagon prepared contingency plans for what a Washington Post report described as weeks of ground operations in Iran. And the price tag? Maintaining this posture cost an estimated $300 million per month. By March 19th, the total cost of the war had already reached $18 billion, and the Pentagon then requested an additional $200 billion. The 2027 defense budget proposal that Hegseth presented to Congress would push total defense spending to a historic $1.5 trillion. These numbers were disclosed. These numbers are real, but they tell only part of the story. Here is where the official narrative begins to crack. When the U.S. and Israel struck Iran, Tehran did not collapse quietly. Iran launched a calibrated, and in many ways devastatingly effective counteroffensive, designed not for symbolic retaliation, but for maximum operational damage to American forward-deployed infrastructure. Investigative findings supported by satellite imagery, battlefield forensics, and interviews with U.S. officials and regional sources reveal that at least 16 United States military installations across the Middle East sustained significant damage from coordinated Iranian missile and drone strikes in early 2026. 16 bases. Iran's targeting methodology was precise and deliberate. They went after high-value, low-redundancy assets. AN/TPY-2 missile defense radars, the backbone of American early warning systems in the region, satellite communications radomes, airborne early warning aircraft, command and control nodes. The result was not just physical destruction, it was operational dislocation. U.S. personnel were dispersed into improvised facilities, hotels, remote outposts, fragmented command nodes. Situational awareness degraded. The integrated air defense network that the U.S. had spent years building was, at least temporarily, disrupted. Now, compare that to what Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth told the public, that Iran's retaliatory capacity had been largely neutralized. Representative Pat Ryan publicly questioned command accountability and demanded leadership consequences. A widening disconnect emerged between the Pentagon's political messaging and battlefield reality. This is not speculation. This is what the evidence shows. The US, Israel, and Iran all implemented varying degrees of censorship to suppress information about the damage each side sustained. President Trump repeatedly claimed victory and asserted that the Iranian military had been destroyed. Meanwhile, Iran's own government assessed the damage to its economy at a minimum of $300 billion and possibly as much as $1 trillion. Both sides were bleeding. Neither side was telling the full truth.
By April 7, 2026, 60 days into the conflict, which also happened to be the legal deadline for unauthorized wars under the War Powers Resolution, President Trump announced a 2-week ceasefire, brokered through Pakistan as an intermediary. The ceasefire was extended. Trump told Congress that hostilities had terminated. But here is the critical context the briefing glossed over. The Trump administration cited the April 8th ceasefire to argue that the president did not have to provide Congress with a formal update under the War Powers Resolution. That law typically requires presidents to seek formal approval from Congress for war activities 60 days after beginning military action. By calling it a ceasefire, they effectively reset the legal clock and sidestepped congressional oversight at one of the most consequential moments of the conflict. Was that a legitimate legal interpretation? Constitutional scholars are divided, but the practical effect is clear. Congress got less information, not more. Now, let's go to the May 5th Pentagon briefing, the one that prompted this analysis. Defense Secretary Hegseth stood at the podium and announced Project Freedom, a U.S. military operation to escort commercial vessels through the Strait of Hormuz. He was careful to describe it as separate and distinct from Operation Epic Fury, the combat mission. He called it defensive in nature,
focused in scope and temporary in duration. But since the ceasefire was declared, Iran had attacked American forces more than 10 times. Iran had fired on commercial vessels 9 times. Iran had seized 2 container ships. General Dan Caine, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, acknowledged these attacks openly at the briefing, but he characterized them as all below the threshold of restarting major combat operations at this point. He described Iran's harassment as low, grasping at straws. He said no adversary should mistake our current restraint for a lack of resolve. That's a carefully worded statement. What it means in plain English is this: the U.S. military is absorbing Iranian attacks and choosing not to respond with full force, for now. The threshold for renewed war exists. It is real. But who defines it? Caine said it plainly. That's a political decision, above my pay grade. So the question of whether America goes back to full-scale war with Iran is not being made by military commanders based on battlefield conditions. It is being made by politicians in Washington, calibrated to domestic political pressures, including the fact that gas prices in the U.S. have risen from below $3 a gallon before the war to $4.48 as of May 5th, 2026. That is a political liability. That is a domestic economic crisis, and that context shapes every single decision being made at the Pentagon right now.
You cannot understand this conflict without understanding the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow waterway, at its tightest point just 21 miles wide, is the jugular vein of the global energy system. Before the war, roughly 1/5 of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas flowed through it every single day. Tankers from Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the UAE, Iraq, and Iran itself passed through in a continuous stream, feeding the energy needs of Asia, Europe, and beyond. When Iran effectively closed the strait after the war began, the consequences were immediate and global. Oil prices skyrocketed. More than 22,500 mariners aboard over 1,550 commercial vessels were trapped in the Gulf, unable to move. They're sitting ducks, Secretary of State Marco Rubio said at a White House briefing. They're isolated, they're starving, they're vulnerable. At least 10 sailors have already died. Iran's leverage in the strait became its most powerful bargaining chip. Without access to that waterway, the economic and political cost of the war to the United States and its allies was unsustainable. The war had to end, or the strait had to reopen. Project Freedom was the American answer. CENTCOM established what Hegseth called a powerful red, white, and blue dome over the strait. More than 100 U.S. military aircraft patrolling the skies, with destroyers, helicopters, drones, and surveillance assets operating around the clock.
But here's what the briefing obscured. As of the day of the press conference, only 2 civilian vessels, both U.S. flagged, had successfully transited the strait under American protection. 2 ships out of 1,500 waiting. Hegseth declared that Iran does not control the strait. Iran's parliament speaker, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, responded on social media, "We know full well that the continuation of the status quo is intolerable for America, while we have not even begun yet." Who was telling the truth? The answer appears to be both, and neither. The U.S. had punched a corridor through, but that corridor was contested, under fire, and barely functional. The situation was far more fragile than the Pentagon's triumphant language suggested. And then, on May 6th, the very day after that confident Pentagon briefing, President Trump announced a temporary pause in Project Freedom. He cited great progress toward a deal. But the timing told a different story. The operation had met fierce Iranian resistance. The ceasefire was under severe strain, and a diplomatic off-ramp was desperately needed. While bombers flew and warships maneuvered, a parallel track of diplomacy was unfolding, one that the Pentagon briefings barely acknowledged. Oman served as the primary back-channel mediator from the very beginning. Foreign Minister Badr bin Hamad al-Busaidi carried messages between Washington and Tehran throughout February. The first round of indirect talks took place on February 6th in Muscat, and notably, CENTCOM Commander Admiral Brad Cooper was present. It was the first time a senior U.S. military commander had participated in negotiations with Iran, signaling that the military dimension of any deal was inseparable from the diplomatic one. Iran's position throughout has centered on 4 demands: guarantees against future military aggression, the withdrawal of U.S. forces from the region surrounding Iran, the release of frozen Iranian assets, and the removal of sanctions. Iran also called for a new mechanism for the Strait of Hormuz, a direct challenge to American naval dominance in the Gulf. The U.S. presented a 9-point proposal. Iran responded with a 14-point counterproposal. By May 6th, negotiations were being conducted through Pakistan as an intermediary, a sign of how degraded direct communication had become. Trump himself was sending mixed signals. On May 3rd, he said, "Maybe we're better off not making a deal at all. We can't let this thing go on." By May 5th, he was telling reporters he was pausing military operations to allow time for a complete and final agreement. The gap between the Pentagon's public confidence and the administration's private desperation was visible in every one of these contradictions.
One of the most revealing moments of the May 5th Pentagon briefing came not from a military revelation, but from a diplomatic complaint. Hegseth called out America's allies by name: South Korea, Japan, Australia, European NATO members. He urged them to step up and join the mission to secure the Strait of Hormuz. None had sent warships. None had committed military assets to the operation. Why does this matter? Because the United States launched Operation Epic Fury without notifying most of its NATO allies. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz publicly stated that the U.S. was being humiliated by Iran, and Trump responded by announcing the withdrawal of roughly 5,000 troops from Germany over the next year. The transatlantic alliance, already strained, was fracturing further under the weight of a war that America's closest partners had no say in starting. Hegseth's appeal to allies at the briefing was, in reality, an admission of isolation. The United States was bearing the full burden of a conflict that its own partners viewed with deep skepticism, and in some cases, outright opposition. Meanwhile, China entered the picture in a way the Pentagon was careful not to overamplify. Trump claimed the U.S. military intercepted a gift from China to Iran, a sanctioned tanker in the Indo-Pacific, suggesting Beijing was providing covert support to Tehran. China denied any deliberate involvement, but the incident underscored the broader geopolitical stakes. This was not just a U.S.-Iran conflict. It was a flashpoint in the global competition between American power and a revisionist bloc willing to probe its limits.
So let's bring it all together. What did the Pentagon tell you on May 5th? And what did they leave out? They told you the ceasefire holds. They did not tell you Iran has attacked American forces more than 10 times since the ceasefire, and the threshold for resumed war is being set by political calculations, not military ones. They told you Project Freedom is open for business, and Iran does not control the strait. They did not tell you only 2 ships had transited the strait as of that briefing, and the operation was paused the very next day. They told you 15,000 U.S. service members and over 100 aircraft are maintaining a powerful defensive posture. They did not tell you 16 American military installations were hit and damaged during Iran's counteroffensive, and the full extent of that damage was suppressed. They told you Iran's retaliatory capacity has been largely neutralized. They did not tell you Iran's parliament speaker was publicly threatening that his country had not even begun yet. They told you the war cost $18 billion as of mid-March. They did not tell you the Pentagon has already requested a further $200 billion, and the administration is pushing for a 2027 defense budget of $1.5 trillion, the highest in American history. And they did not tell you this. The War Powers Resolution,
The law designed to prevent presidents from waging unauthorized wars was effectively sidestepped by declaring a ceasefire at the exact legal deadline, resetting the clock on congressional oversight at the most critical moment of the conflict.
As of today, May 7th, 2026, the situation remains extraordinarily fluid. Iran has submitted a 14-point peace proposal. The U.S. has presented a 9-point counterproposal. Talks are being mediated through Pakistan. Trump has paused Project Freedom to create diplomatic space. But the naval blockade of Iranian ports, in place since April 13th, remains. American warships are still positioned across the Gulf. 3 carrier strike groups remain in the region. And the ceasefire, such as it is being violated almost daily. The economic toll continues to mount. Gas prices in the United States remain near record highs. Iran's economy has sustained damage its own government estimates between $300 billion and $1 trillion. The Arab states surrounding the conflict have collectively absorbed over $120 billion in economic losses. The world's most critical energy corridor, the Strait of Hormuz, remains contested. Global shipping remains disrupted. The price of oil continues to send shockwaves through economies from Seoul to Frankfurt to Sao Paulo. And in Washington, the political pressure is intensifying. Democrats and Republicans alike are raising questions about congressional oversight, the legal justification for the war, and the true cost of a conflict that was launched, according to the evidence, on the basis of intelligence that even the Pentagon's own sources described as incomplete.
Pentagon briefings are, by design, a form of wartime communications from any government. The U.S. military has legitimate reasons to withhold sensitive operational details. No one is suggesting that every classified piece of information should be made public. But there is a difference between protecting operational security and managing public perception. There is a difference between strategic ambiguity and misleading the people whose tax dollars are funding the war, whose sons and daughters are serving in it, and who will live with its consequences for decades. The May 5th briefing gave us images of American dominance, carrier strike groups, air domes over the strait, hundreds of jets and destroyers on station. It gave us sound bites about Iran being embarrassed, about Iran not controlling the waterway they claim to control. What it did not give us was an honest accounting of the damage sustained, the fragility of the ceasefire, the diplomatic isolation of the United States among its own allies, the legal questions surrounding congressional oversight, or the genuine uncertainty about whether this war is heading toward a negotiated peace or a resumed escalation that could draw in China, destabilize the entire Gulf region, and reshape the global energy order for a generation.
Those are the questions that matter. Those are the questions the briefing was not designed to answer. And that is why, whether you support this war or oppose it, whether you trust this administration or distrust it, you owe it to yourself to look beyond the podium, to ask the questions the reporters didn't, to read between the lines of carefully crafted statements, to demand the full picture. Because, in the end, this is not just a story about Iran. It is a story about the relationship between American power and American transparency. And how we navigate that relationship, right now, in this moment, will determine not just the outcome of this conflict, but the kind of country we choose to be. Thank you for watching. Stay informed, stay critical, and we'll see you next time.